The popularity of the iMusic app continues to grow, and a common request we're getting from our user base is to allow sorting of the music list. Our default sort order made sense when we first developed this feature, but as users manage an ever-growing list of albums, it can be difficult to locate albums quickly. In this lesson, we'll add the ability to sort the music list by date or by name, and we'll make that sort setting a sticky preference so that it can be persisted across restarts. iOS provides the infrastructure for storing user preferences. User preference data is stored in what's called the defaults system, and the interface we have to interact with this system is called NSUserDefaults. This class provides an interface that looks very similar to an NSMutable dictionary, which allows us to read and write key-value pair data that will be persisted to the file system. This will be a perfect fit for us to store the user's sorting preference. So let's go about implementing this feature. I'll begin by adding a segmented control to the music list navigation bar. This will allow us to toggle between sorting by date or by name. I'll start with the iPhone storyboard. I'll zoom in on the music list. I'll look for a segmented control. So I'll highlight this and drag and drop this on top of our iMusic list title. This segmented control will simply replace that title. I'll double-click this component and give it the name, and the second index I will call date. I'll open up the Assistant Editor. Start by creating a property to reference this component. I'll call this sort control. I'll additionally define an action method called sortList. And this method will be invoked to actually sort our lists. I'll save this and switch over to the iPad storyboard and do the same thing there. So I'll add a segmented control here as well. Call that name. Call that one date. And we need to make sure this is hooked up to the outlet and action methods. Simply control and drag to that property reference. That will hook that up, and same thing for the action method. And we can verify that this is hooked up in both storyboards by clicking this little dot, and we can see it's referenced in both the iPad and iPhone storyboard. Same thing with our action method. Save that, compile. Alright, I'll switch over to the music list view controller. Let's do a little bit of refactoring to our viewWillAppear method. I'll highlight these two lines of code and right-click and say refactor, extract. And I'll extract this out to a new method called reloadData. That looks good. Alright, so here's my new method, and we can see in the viewWillAppear method, it's invoking reloadData. And in the reloadData method, we'll perform our actual sorting. I'll start by defining a couple constant values. I'll create one to represent our sort key, and this will be the property that we actually persist in the defaults. I'll then create two NSInteger constants, and their values of 0 and 1 will correspond to the indexes in our segmented control. I'll scroll down to the reloadData method. I'll then look up the NSUserDefaults, calling it standard userDefaults method, and this will return the singleton instance of this class that exists within our application. From that NSUserDefaults instance, I'll call its integer for key method, passing in our sort key that we defined above, and this will return the current sort by value. If the user's never set this value, this call is simply going to return 0, which would correspond with our by name sorting routine. So that'll actually work just fine. I'll then verify the current sort by value, and if the sort by is sort by name, I'm going to create a thing called an NSSort descriptor. And an NSSort descriptor just says how I want to sort a collection of objects. In this case, if the user is selected by name, we want to sort by the album name property. So I create an NSSort descriptor using its sort descriptor with key, which represents our property. I'll say ascending yes, and this just means sort from A to Z. On our array of albums, I'll then call its sort using descriptors method and create an array with just a single descriptor element in there. And that will actually perform the sort of our album list. We don't need to define an else condition in this case because if the user selected by date, that will just be our default sort ordering and we don't need to take any additional action. Let me just save that and compile. That looks good. Now let me scroll down. It added our sort list at the bottom. Let me just move this up into the same area so that we can see this easily. Now in our sort list method, the first thing we're going to want to do is look up the selected index. So this is probably the first time we're actually evaluating that sender argument that gets passed in this action method. And we can ask the sender for its selected segment index. So that way we'll know which one of those values the user tapped. I'll look up that NSUser defaults. I'll call user defaults set integer and pass in that index for the key, our sort key. And then I'm going to call synchronize. Changes you're making to NSUser defaults are just stored in memory. And then periodically the system will save those or synchronize those to disk. You can explicitly call the synchronize method to immediately write that to disk. That's usually not necessary, or at least you can simply defer that call until your application is going to shut down. But in this case, I'll just call synchronize to make sure everything's in sync. Let me compile this and let's run it. We can see that our music list is now sorted alphabetically. Let me switch to date. And we can see that made no change. I guess the one thing I forgot to do is I need to go and call that reload data method. So I'll shut this down and call this. Scroll this into view. I'll call self reload data. Let's try that again. So ordered by name and now ordered by date. So I can toggle back and forth. Let me close the app and reopen it again to make sure that that date setting is saved. We can see that our list is sorted correctly. Unfortunately, the segmented control doesn't represent the current sort order. So we'll need to make one additional change. Let me go to the viewDidLoad method. And in the last line, let me look up the current setting from the NSUser defaults, and we'll ask for that sorting value, and then appropriately set the selected segment index on that sort control. Let's try that again. There we go. Now we can see that the date was properly persisted. Switch to name and run it one more time just to make sure that's still sticky. Looks good. Let's additionally run the iPad version to make sure that's working. So it's currently set to name. I'll change it to date. Shut that down. Open it up again. Okay, that looks good. So both our iPhone and iPad versions appear to be working correctly. In this lesson, we saw how to use the NSUserDefaults class to store user preferences. This class is easy to use and pretty straightforward, and our feature works as intended. However, many of our users are running both the iPhone and iPad versions. It seems likely that they'd like to have that same preference set on both versions of the app. Currently, we only have a single preference, so it's probably not that big of a deal. But what if we add another? What if we add several? I wonder if there's a way we could improve upon this approach. I'm going to go have a cool, refreshing beverage and think about this some more. I'll let you know in the next lesson if I come up with anything.